There are books that describe the world as it appears. And then there are books that describe the world as it actually is. Books that pull back the surface of things and show the machinery underneath. Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, originally published in French in 1954 as La Technique ou l'enjeu du siècle and translated into English in 1964, is one of those rare works. It is a French Protestant theologian and sociologist sitting down in the early post-war years, looking at the entire arc of modern civilization and calmly announcing that something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong, and that almost no one has noticed, because the thing that has gone wrong is the very lens through which we now see everything else. Ellul's central concept is technique, and he is careful, from the first page, to distinguish it from technology in the ordinary sense. Technique is not machines, it is not engineering, it is not any particular invention. Technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency in every field of human activity. It is the universal drive to find the one best way to do anything, and then to impose that way. It is the spirit of optimization given social form. The machine is merely technique made visible. Technique itself has colonized law, medicine, education, government, psychology, art, and warfare with equal thoroughness. This summary is a chapter-by-chapter guide through Ellul's argument, one of the most important and most underread diagnoses of the modern condition ever written. Ellul was born in Bordeaux in 1912. He trained as a legal scholar, converted to Christianity through a reading of Marx and then of Paul, and spent his career teaching at the University of Bordeaux while writing prolifically in theology and sociology, treating them as two aspects of a single project. The Technological Society was his sociological masterwork, the book that made his name in America, if not in his own country. Robert Merton called it a major work of our time. Aldous Huxley was overwhelmed by it. And then, as often happens with books that see too clearly, it was widely cited and inadequately absorbed. The book opens by demanding that the reader abandon a comfortable assumption, that we live in a technological society because we have built a great many machines. Ellul turns this on its head. Machines did not create technique. Technique created the conditions under which machines became possible and then inevitable. Technique is older and deeper than industrialism. To understand where we are, Ellul argues, we must understand how we got here. And the story begins not in the 19th century, but in the ancient world. In traditional societies, Ellul shows, technique existed but was contained. The hunter, the farmer, the craftsman all used methods aimed at efficiency, but those methods were embedded in a web of ritual, custom, taboo, and sacred limitation. Technique in the pre-modern world was always counterbalanced by what Ellul calls magical technique, the ritualized, symbolic, collective dimensions of life that surrounded every practical activity and gave it meaning beyond mere output. When a farmer planted, he did not only till soil, he participated in a cosmos. When a craftsman forged iron, the forge itself was alive with significance. This balance meant that efficiency was never the only value in play. Tradition, beauty, right relationship, the sacred, these were co-equal claimants on human action. The great rupture came, Ellul argues, in the transition from the ancient Mediterranean world through the Middle Ages toward modernity. The rupture was not the Industrial Revolution. That was a consequence, not a cause. The real rupture was the slow dissolution of the sacred and communal constraints on technique, and Ellul identifies 5 specific conditions that, converging in the 19th century, finally let technique break free. The first was the maturation of science. By 1800, the accumulated body of scientific knowledge had reached a threshold where it could be systematically applied to practical problems in ways never before possible. The second was economic. A relatively stable market economy provided the capital and incentive structure within which technical improvements could be rapidly monetized and diffused. The third was population growth, which both demanded more efficient production and supplied the labor pools and mass markets that technique required. The fourth was the openness of Western society to technical application across all domains, not merely industry, but governance, medicine, war, and everyday life. And the fifth, the deepest, was what Ellul calls social plasticity, the collective willingness, unique to the modern West, to abandon inherited traditions, local customs, and communal ties in pursuit of individual advancement and material improvement. Social plasticity is not merely an attitude, it is a civilizational condition. The erasure of the barriers that had always kept technique in its place. What Ellul establishes here, in this first movement of his argument, is something that should disturb any serious thinker. The barriers that once constrained technique were not irrational. They were not mere superstition. They were the accumulated wisdom of communities that understood, if not in philosophical language, that efficiency untethered from meaning is a form of destruction. The sacred, the ritual, the taboo, these were load-bearing walls. Modernity tore them out. Having established where technique came from and how it escaped its constraints, Ellul turns to the question of what technique actually is. Not historically, but structurally. What are its defining characteristics? And here he produces one of the most precise and unsettling philosophical descriptions in 20th century thought. Technique, Ellul argues, has 7 characteristics, and they must be understood together as a system. The first is rationality. Technique always operates through conscious, deliberate calculation. It breaks every activity into analyzable elements, subjects them to logical operations, and reconstructs them according to the most efficient sequence. There is nothing spontaneous or organic about technique. It is always, in the deepest sense, planned. The second characteristic is artificiality. Technique is systematically at war with the natural. It does not merely modify nature, it suppresses it, replaces it, treats it as raw material to be processed. Wherever technique advances, the natural retreats. The third characteristic is automatism, and this is where Ellul's argument begins to bite most sharply. In any situation where multiple technical methods are available, the most efficient one will always win. Not because anyone chooses it, but because efficiency is the criterion by which all technical choices are made. Choice, in the technical domain, is not really free. It is predetermined by the logic of the system. The fourth characteristic is self-augmentation. Technique builds on itself. Each technical advance creates new problems and new opportunities that only further technical advances can address. There is no external limit to this process, no point at which technique says enough. The fifth is monism or wholeness. All the individual techniques of a civilization are not merely related, but form a single interconnected system. You cannot adopt the techniques of industrial production without also adopting, over time, the techniques of industrial organization, industrial medicine, industrial psychology, industrial education. They come as a package. The sixth characteristic is universalism. Technique is not culturally specific. It recognizes no border, no civilization, no tradition as a limit. A technique that works in France, works in Japan, works in the Congo. This universalism is not neutral, it is imperial. It dissolves particular cultures by making their pre-technical ways of life economically and organizationally inefficient by comparison. And the seventh, the most radical, is autonomy. Technique has become, in the modern world, genuinely self-directing. It does not respond to human values, moral choices, or political decisions. It follows its own internal logic. When a government or a corporation or an individual adopts a technical system, they do not control it. It controls them. These 7 characteristics together produce something that functions, Ellul suggests, less like a tool than like an environment. The fish does not choose water. The modern person does not choose technique. It is the element in which we are immersed, the air we breathe, the assumption behind every assumption. And this is precisely why it is so difficult to see. We have identified progress with technical progress so thoroughly that to question technique is to appear to question progress itself, which is to appear irrational, reactionary, even dangerous. Ellul's achievement in this chapter is to make the invisible visible. From the philosophical foundations, Ellul moves to the territory most people associate with economic analysis, but his treatment bears no resemblance to conventional economics of either the left or the right. The relationship between technique and the economy, he argues, has been systematically misunderstood by nearly every school of thought. Because every school of thought has taken technique for granted as a neutral background condition rather than identifying it as the primary actor. The Marxist tradition attributes the distortions of industrial capitalism to the class relations of ownership. If the means of production were socially owned, the argument goes, economic life would be rational and humane. Ellul dismisses this entirely. Technique does not care who owns the factory. The requirements of technical efficiency, the discipline of the assembly line, the subordination of the worker to the machine's rhythm, the reduction of human beings to measurable inputs, are identical whether the factory is owned by a capitalist or a commissar. The Soviet Union demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Collectivization did not humanize industrial technique. It merely applied it more ruthlessly, with the state as the enforcing agent instead of the market. The problem was never capitalism. The problem is technique itself. But Ellul is equally uninterested in the market-liberal celebration of technical progress as the engine of prosperity. The price mechanism, however remarkable as an information processing device, cannot answer questions that are not put to it in monetary terms. It cannot price the dissolution of community, the destruction of craft knowledge, the colonization of leisure by consumption, the erosion of the human person's sense of meaning and agency. Technique economizes everything, including the human soul, and the market records the resulting prices without registering the losses. Ellul observes that the most technically advanced economies have not produced human flourishing in any deep sense. They have produced material abundance alongside a spreading spiritual and social impoverishment that the abundance itself helps conceal. What technique has done to the economy, in Ellul's reading, is transform it from a system that serves human needs into a system that serves technical imperatives. Production no longer exists to provide what people genuinely need. It exists to keep the technical apparatus running at full capacity. Consumption must be endlessly stimulated to absorb what the technical apparatus endlessly produces. Work must be reorganized over and over to conform to the latest technical optimum. The human being is not the purpose of the economic system. He is a component in it. And this inversion, Ellul argues, is not the result of bad policy or malicious ownership. It is the structural consequence of allowing technique to become autonomous. If the economy is disturbing, the analysis of technique and the state is alarming. Ellul demonstrates, with historical precision, that the modern state is not merely a political structure that happens to use technical means. The modern state is a technical achievement. It arose precisely through the application of technique to the problem of governing large populations, and it cannot be separated from the technical apparatus through which it operates. This matters because it means that the standard political debates, liberty versus equality, capitalism versus socialism, democracy versus authoritarianism, are largely beside the point. Every modern state, whatever its ideological commitments, requires the same technical infrastructure: centralized data collection and processing, standardized administrative procedures, mass communication systems, techniques of public management and social control. The more technique advances, the more all states converge on the same structural form, regardless of their official ideologies. The difference between a liberal democracy and a totalitarian state is, on this analysis, a difference of degree and of the management of consent, not a difference of kind. Ellul is particularly sharp on the relationship between technique and political propaganda. Modern states do not govern primarily through force. They govern through the management of public opinion and behavior, and this management is itself a technical enterprise. The techniques of advertising, public relations, political communication, and mass media are not ornaments added to an otherwise genuine political process. They are the substance of how modern governance actually operates. The citizen is managed as skillfully and systematically as any other input to the technical system, and the management becomes more sophisticated with every generation. There is no sentimentality in Ellul about the possibilities of political reform. He does not believe that electing better leaders or adopting better policies can fundamentally alter the relationship between technique and the state, because the state has become structurally dependent on technical rationality. Any politician who genuinely tried to govern against the logic of technique, to prioritize human particularity over administrative uniformity, local community over centralized efficiency, tradition over optimization, would find themselves immediately incapacitated by the apparatus they were trying to control. The machine has its own requirements, and those requirements are not negotiable. Perhaps the most disturbing section of the technological society is the chapter on human technique, the application of the methods of technique not to material production or political administration, but to the human being himself. By Ellul's time, the project was already well advanced. Psychoanalysis, behaviorism, educational psychology, vocational guidance, personnel management, advertising, propaganda. Each of these represented the systematic application of technical rationality to the task of shaping, managing, and optimizing human beings. Ellul is not dismissing these disciplines as fraudulent. He acknowledges that psychology can genuinely illuminate aspects of human behavior, that educational technique can improve certain measurable outcomes, that management science can increase organizational efficiency. His concern is structural, not empirical. When technique is applied to the human person, it treats him as an object, an input to be optimized, a variable to be managed, a problem to be solved. The irreducible interiority of the person, the fact that he is a subject and not merely an object, the dimensions of his existence that cannot be measured or optimized, these are systematically excluded from the technical framework, not because they are unimportant, but because they are technically intractable. The consequences are profound and compound over time. Education increasingly becomes the production of technically useful persons rather than the formation of human beings. Medicine increasingly treats the body as a malfunctioning machine rather than attending to the suffering person who inhabits it. Psychology increasingly aims at behavioral adjustment rather than genuine healing of the soul. Work is organized not to provide meaningful activity, but to extract maximum technical output. Leisure is colonized by industries that sell manufactured experience as a substitute for genuine life. At every point, the human person is reduced, not through cruelty, but through the impersonal logic of technical optimization, to a more manageable, more predictable, more efficient version of himself. What is lost in this reduction is precisely what made him human. Ellul here is touching something that the entire tradition of Christian anthropology, East and West, has always insisted on, that the human person possesses a depth, an interiority, a capacity for union with God and genuine communion with other persons, that cannot be captured by any material or functional description. The Greek fathers called this the nous, the spiritual eye, the deepest faculty of the person, oriented toward the divine. Technique, systematically applied to human beings, does not merely fail to cultivate the nous. It creates conditions actively hostile to its exercise. The final chapter of the technological society is Ellul looking into the future, and what he sees there, writing in 1954, is remarkable in its accuracy and terrifying in its implications. He does not predict specific inventions. He predicts the trajectory of a civilization that has made technique its ultimate value, and he describes where that trajectory leads. The future Ellul envisions is not dystopian in the dramatic science fiction sense. There are no jackbooted overlords, no concentration camps, no obvious moment of collapse. It is subtler and more total. The future Ellul describes is a world in which human beings are comfortable, entertained, medically maintained, and spiritually hollow. A world in which all the problems that technique can solve have been solved, and all the problems that technique cannot solve, meaning love, freedom, genuine community, encounter with the transcendent, have been forgotten because the very categories required to articulate them have been quietly dissolved. He foresees a world in which psychology and neuroscience will be applied to the human organism with such precision that psychological suffering will be managed out of existence, not by healing the causes of suffering, but by technically eliminating the capacity to feel its depths. He foresees an educational system that will produce persons perfectly adapted to the technical environment, curious about what technique has determined they should be curious about, motivated by what the system has designed them to want, unable to conceive of any good that the system has not validated. He foresees political management of such sophistication that genuine opposition will become structurally impossible, not because it is suppressed by force, but because the technical management of opinion will ensure that opposition never crystallizes into a coherent challenge. And he foresees, most prophetically of all, that technology will solve the problem of its own criticism. Any critique of technique will itself be absorbed into the technical system, processed, managed, and neutralized. The critic of technique will be offered a more efficient platform for their criticism. Their critique will be studied, packaged, and sold. The energy of opposition will be converted into content. Writing in 1954, Ellul described with uncanny precision the dynamics that would define the Internet age, the transformation of every human impulse, including the impulse toward freedom and transcendence, into a technically managed product. What haunts the reader at the close is Ellul's insistence that he offers no solution. He is not a pessimist in the sense of one who has given up on the human person. He is, rather, a diagnostician who refuses false comfort. The situation is genuinely grave. The path back is not obvious. What Ellul insists on, from his Christian standpoint, is that no technical solution to the problem of technique is possible, because any such solution would simply extend technique's dominion. What is required is something outside technique entirely, a recovery of the human, the personal, the transcendent, the genuinely free. The Technological Society is, 70 years after its composition, one of the most relevant books a person can read. Not because Ellul was correct about every detail. He was writing before the Internet, before biotechnology, before the algorithmic management of human attention had become the central economic project of the most powerful corporations in history. He was correct about the trajectory. He was correct about the logic. He was correct that technique would become the air we breathe and the water we swim in, invisible precisely because it is total. The orthodox tradition from which Ellul himself wrote, he was a reformed Christian, but his diagnosis resonates deeply with the patristic understanding of what the person is and what threatens the person, insists that the human being is made for something that no technique can provide and no efficiency can optimize. The Hesychast masters who taught that the heart must become quiet before it can hear God were describing, in the language of prayer, exactly what Ellul describes in the language of sociology, that the technically managed life is a life in which the deepest human capacities are systematically suppressed. What both traditions converge on is the same truth, that a civilization organized around technique has organized itself around the wrong thing, and that the cost, measured not in production statistics, but in souls, is incalculable. Read the full book. Sit with it. It will change what you see when you look at the world you live in.